They called our planets death worlds, and their children monsters. They catalogued us as biological anomalies and logistical liabilities. They built treaties around us and quarantine zones like grave markers. They crossed us once out of arrogance, and they paid in months, not years. What they did not understand was the design that birthed us: calibrated violence and slow, patient adaptation. We were grown in storms, fed on radiation, tempered under gravity that bent bone into weapon. When you raise a species inside an environment that refuses gentleness, you do not produce soldiers. You produce a law of survival so absolute it becomes culture, and then religion. We learned to use the planet's hostility as a map. We learned its currents and fractures, the way predators read weather. We learned that an enemy's first mistake is to assume the environment belongs to them. They never suspected the soil could be an accomplice. They never suspected the wind would pick sides. We were not cunning in the way their scholars described. We were methodical. We catalogued threats like a military ledger and executed measures like ritual. We were efficient because inefficiency is the kind of luxury deathworlds deny. When the fleet first arrived, their lights turned the night into a theater. They spoke of diplomacy and escorts, of colonization and resource surveys. They wore uniforms stitched from confident ignorance. Their ships descended like confident teeth. We watched the first settlers with the polite attention of a surgeon watching an organ fail. They planted flags, sensors, and small homesteads with defensible perimeters. The perimeters taught them their first lesson. A fence is a statement. On a death world, the soil reads statements as invitations. They came with artillery and suits that whispered comfort and numbers. They did not come with humility. The first casualties were infrastructure. Power grids harvested into nests, communication arrays woven into traps. When their engineers stomped across the tundra, the land rearranged its teeth. A road would become a gorge overnight. A supply line would find its vehicles turned to bone and rust in a single dawn. They lost technicians, then detachments, then confidence. They responded with containment protocols and punitive sweeps. The name for our people on their tongues was a weapon they could not deliver. They tried to fireproof their ships against our storms, to insulate their minds from our myths. They erected observation platforms and scanned for patterns. Patterns emerged. We moved like a consonant struck from the throat of the planet, abrupt, decisive, musical only to those who know the rhythm. Where they saw chaos, we saw choreography. Our strike doctrine was quiet as tectonics and precise as scalpel work. We taught ourselves to borrow the planet's patience and fold their arrogance into traps. We used an enemy's predictability like a whetstone. They brought their infantry down in waves, and we met them with vectors the planet had composed. Ambushes were not random fury. They were geometry executed with the inevitability of gravity. A ridge would cough them up. A valley would swallow their radios. A wind would carry their own scent codes back into their faces. Sometimes we let the machines live long enough to tell stories, to convince the next pilot that the ghosts of the first strike were still listening. Fear is a multiplier on a death world. It bends resources and focus into sharp angles. They sent specialists next, those who believed complexity could outmaneuver nature. They called them scientists and masters of systems. They orchestrated experiments like temples. They built small models of our ecosystems in glass and lit them with cold suns. They thought replication was control. They were wrong. Nature does not reveal its whole face in a lab. It hides its teeth until you are already halfway into the experiment. They unleashed containment fields and microclimate domes, icons of dominion. Inside those domes, life behaved itself for a while, because a cage can teach obedience. But obedience is a brittle thing when the world outside hums with other laws. One night, a microbe refused the boundaries of the glass. It mutated with indifference and found a language that bypassed filters. A virus of habit and hunger slipped through code, across seals, into the air their suits depended on. It was not dramatic like stories said. It was clinical, a letter written in base pairs that pleated into new action. It found their lungs and their software, and it taught both to cough. They called it contamination and declared emergency zones with proclamations stamped by committees. They convened panels that spoke in careful syllables, while their technicians collapsed under the weight of simple biology.
It was not the microbe alone that ended their initial wave. It was the principle of the world teaching itself back through the very instruments they used to study it. We did not need to lead the charge, the planet did. We merely read the signatures it left and leaned into them. Their capitals fell not in grand sieges, but in sequences of denied logistics. A supply chain folded quietly when its nodes stopped answering. A warship could be magnificent and still be a monument to a lost fuel depot. They fought as if the battlefield were a place, not a system. We fought like the system. We were patient, because patience was an economy we could sustain indefinitely. We were ruthless, because the planet had taught us that mercy on a death world is a misapplied resource. When the council convened in a glass city on a distant moon, they read our file as if we were a failed experiment to be catalogued, a cautionary tale for future settlers. They debated treaties and reparations and the ethics of extinction. They sent envoys with clipped manners and encrypted threats. One envoy carried a token, an olive branch with a sensor inside, as if peace could be measured. We received the token in a place that did not habitually receive visitors, a ridgeline altar of basalt and iron. We left the branch where it would rot quick and clean in the salt wind. Then we sent our reply. It was not a speech, it was an operation. It began with silence and ended with law. They learned that our justice ran on principles older than their calendars. Every action had a cost, every trespass an accounting. When they executed reprisal strikes, they found eviction notices in the language of survival. A mining convoy went missing, and a week later their flagship lost command crew to malfunction that mimicked human sabotage. They spun conspiracy theories and issued ultimatums. We answered in a ledger of consequences. We took strategic nodes, shut down their satellites in patterns that looked like constellations burning out. Their navigation maps began to look like our scrolled plans. They hunted us with sensors and algorithms and found corridors of emptiness where data should have been. They began to suspect the planet itself was conspiring. Their historians called our methods guerrilla or irregular, and they wrote obituaries for tactics that failed against a homegrown doctrine. But historians read endings and rarely the slow movements that create them. Our ascension was not a sudden coronation. It was a sequence of attritions and adaptations measured in breaths and seasons. We learned not just to strike, but to govern the silence that followed. We intercepted their rescue teams and rerouted them into misunderstandings. We let their propaganda die on foreign lips, replaced by news stories the wind carried home. Stories are weapons on a death world. They shape expectation, and expectation controls movement. Once fear infects a culture, it self-propagates faster than any microbe. Their commanders began to issue orders with the tremor of men who had read too many dead reports. Their pilots stayed low and kept to corridors we allowed, like captives led through a garden of barbed promises. Governments in their capitals debated escalation and restraint, each choice an answer to a calculus they did not fully understand. A treaty was signed on paper smoothed by diplomats' fingers, but treaties are only as durable as the enforcement behind them.
We introduced enforcement as inevitability and named it consequence. We did not massacre without purpose, nor did we ransom lives for spectacle. We took symbolic strikes that reprogrammed fear into respect. One admiral's fleet found its engines fouled by organisms that chewed through alloys. Their signal beacons sang back coordinates that led them into empty space. Another colony woke to find its children taught by the land itself. Plants that produced sap that calmed them into submission, then taught them how to survive on roots and stone. We turned their comforts into teachers that whispered replacement lessons. Every loss we imposed had a metric: resources conserved, future threats neutralized, culture recalibrated. We were architects of deterrence. We made their deterrent logic meet a mirror. When the last large-scale invasion was planned, their conferences glowed with strategy like stained glass. They had assembled every model and wargame, simulated every contingency, and they believed simulation equaled dominion. They landed with more brass and software than ever before. They thought certainty would solve uncertainty. They thought numbers could outpace a planet's cunning. They were wrong again. On the day of the invasion, the sky was a map of fire and glass. Their engines harmonized into an arrogance that vibrated across the plains. We met them with apertures of silence. A strike here, a withdrawal there, a collapse of infrastructure that read like a surgical excision. Their best units bled into terrain that folded them into history. The survivors carried tales back to their fleets, tales with details that tasted like myth because only myth can hold such cruelty. They called our leaders monsters and gods in the same breath, not knowing the difference. Monsters hold terror. Gods carry law. We preferred the latter. After the fighting, when the dust became a new kind of map, we did not celebrate in the manner of conquerors. There is no glory in survival that costs more than the future. We established institutions that read like ritual, watchposts that doubled as classrooms, harvesters that also taught resource stewardship, and courts that enforced a simple calculus: survive, adapt, and do not see death beyond the borders that contain you. Our doctrine hardened into governance, turned sharp lessons into steady policy. We reforged ourselves into a civilization that respected the planet and used the planet to protect itself. We did not merely repel them, we taught the galaxy how expensive it could be to misunderstand a death world. Across systems, diplomats retold our story in the tone of cautionary tale and worship. Treaties proliferated with clauses that read like prayers. Some called us cruel, some called us necessary. In quiet rooms where strategy had once been carved, they drew maps with thicker borders. They placed buffer zones and sent fewer feet into our fields. Fear curdled into protocol. Time made agreements of its own. A generation grew where children learned the geometry of storms and the etiquette of silence. They learned how to bend their bodies into machines of endurance and how to set snares of thought that kept outsiders predictable. We became a nation that kept its myths in the language of machinery, its poetry in tactical diagrams. When outsiders came now, they came with questions and with permits. They came with moments of humility that sometimes looked like gifts. We accepted those that could prove their weight and buried the rest under the language of consequence. And still the galaxy watched us like an experiment in a jar, fascinated by the light that stubbornly refused to dim. They will write books and spin theories and name our tactics after their generals. They will teach the next generation that Deathworlders are cautions, to be studied and respected. But listen close, and you will hear the other truth, muffled under proclamations and treaties. We are not the thing they fear most. We are the proof that a species raised by a planet can become the planet's hand. When you grow inside a world that will not be tamed, you do not learn to conquer it, you learn to be it. And when the galaxy mistakes that relentlessness for malice, they discover the price of misreading a law for a threat. This is the report of a people who became a defense, a culture that turned survival into strategy and then doctrine. Remember this when you plan your next survey, when you draw maps and send your fleets. Do not confuse the calm for invitation. Do not invite us to correct your arrogance. On Deathworlds, the soil keeps its own counsel, and it teaches those who listen how to answer.